So let me say good morning to you all and welcome you to the session. I'm Fred Lamb, the chair of the APS Forum on Physics and Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium. It's session G07 on nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and non-proliferation. This is also the session at which this year's recipients of the APS Joseph A. Burton and Leo Szilard Awards will speak to us. It's one of 5 sessions that the Forum on Physics and Society has organized at this meeting. There are more to come. K07 on defending Earth from asteroids this afternoon. M07 on reducing the dangers and spread of nuclear weapons. Q07 on human and environmental impacts of nuclear weapon testing. Those last 2 are tomorrow. Also, I'd like to invite you to come to session R09, which is the FPS business meeting, and to tell us about what you'd like the forum to be doing, but also meet this year's prize winners and have some light refreshments and get to know your colleagues. So let me turn now to our first speaker, Richard Meserve. He's currently Senior of Counsel in Washington, D.C. at the law firm of Covington and Burling. He's President Emeritus of the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington. He previously served as chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission under both Presidents Clinton and Bush. He led the NRC's response to the terrorism threat that came to the fore after the 9/11 attacks. Richard has a law degree from Harvard and a PhD in applied physics from Stanford, and was a law clerk for Justice Harry Blackmun. He devoted his legal practice to technical issues at the intersection of science, law, and public policy. He is this year's recipient of the Joseph A. Burton Forum Award, which recognizes outstanding contributions to the public understanding or resolution of issues involving the interface of physics and society. Richard received this award for outstanding service to science and to the nation in the safe, secure, and peaceful use of nuclear power. Also, for the proper and powerful application of science in important legal matters and to wise counsel on policy issues involving science. So he'll speak to us today about laying the foundation for advanced nuclear reactors. Please help me welcome Richard.
Good morning. Thank you, Fred, for the introduction. I am going to talk to you about nuclear issues this morning. I am, as Fred indicated, the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but I've been very actively involved on nuclear matters through my entire career. I've been an advisor to several U.S. utilities. I've been an advisor to the International Atomic Energy Agency on nuclear safety. I am currently an advisor to the government of Japan in its response to the Fukushima accident. And I've also chaired a number of studies by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and involved in a current study on advanced reactors. So let me set the context here first. I'm sure most of you who follow nuclear matters will be fully aware of this. As you can see, we have 92 reactors, now actually 93, as the Vogtle 3 reactors in Georgia have just coming online, just been synchronized to the grid. They're at 54 nuclear power stations in the United States. They provide about 20%, a little under 20% of our electricity. And they really have a remarkable record. Capacity factors are typically, in recent years, of 93 or 94%. That means that if they were to run full power for a full year, that would be 100%. And these reactors are astonishing in terms of their reliability. They provide about half of the carbon-free generation that's currently part of our electricity grid. But they're quite old. Their average age is about 40 years. Nearly the entire fleet has had life extensions to 60 years, and a handful have received NRC authorization to run for 80 years. There's an elaborate regulatory process to assure that the safety margins can be maintained over that period. Despite this remarkable performance, there is no interest that I can detect among US utilities to build new plants of the type that we currently use. The reason is largely the experience with the Westinghouse AP1000 reactors that were built at Vogtle and were started at Summer in South Carolina. The Summer plants were delayed, way over budget, ultimately canceled. The Vogtle reactors ended up costing twice what they had original estimates and have been just coming online, and they're 7 years late, at a cost of $31 billion ultimately to the ratepayers in Georgia, initially by Southern Company. That is a bet your company proposition for a US utility to build a gigawatt scale reactor that costs $7-8 billion. The risk is too great, the delays, the experience. And the US experience in building reactors is quite comparable to that in Europe, where similarly reactors, gigawatt scale reactors, have typically been long delayed and way over budget. This poses a particular problem as we try to move to a world with reduced carbon emissions. As you see that on the slide, they're very elaborate commitments that the US has made. It's going to be very difficult to meet them at the same time that electricity demand in the United States is projected to increase significantly over the coming years. You all are familiar with the comparative greenhouse gas emissions. The 50% of our power that isn't provided, 60% of our power that isn't provided by nuclear and other low carbon sources is principally these days from gas and declining percentage from coal. And of course, those are the worst offenders from the carbon viewpoint, coal being much worse than gas, of course. And even with carbon capture and sequestration, they are still well above the low carbon sources. Low carbon sources being including hydro. We've limited capacity to expand hydro, other than perhaps slow-head hydro in some places. And of course, photovoltaics and wind. Now, we all anticipate that photovoltaics and wind should grow. They should grow. We want them to grow. But the challenge is meeting the intermittency challenge that they present. And of course, the problem was well beyond electricity. In terms of emissions, about 30% of emissions comes from electricity, with a huge amount from transportation and industry. And if we're going to meet these greenhouse gas targets in the United States, we need to deal with all the sectors, not just the electricity sector. That probably means use of electricity to replace the fossil sources we're using in those other sectors. And of course, that's happening, appears to be happening in the light-duty vehicle area as well, with regard to, as we're moving into electric vehicles. It's going to be a problem for heavy trucks and certainly a problem for long-distance airplanes. Because there are very significant challenges that need to be confronted. Given the immensity of the change of the whole energy system, there's trillions of dollars are going to have to be spent on building new infrastructure to decarbonize and meet the expected increasing demand. And a particular challenge, though we all want renewables to succeed, as they become an increasingly strong part of the grid, there is a challenge that comes from the fact that they're intermittent. Now, the diurnal intermittency can probably be solved by batteries, but the problem is that you actually look at the availability of renewable energy over time, you can go weeks with very little capacity being generated from both of those sources. And so there is a challenge over the longer term. Batteries get hugely expensive, and you build more and more batteries that you only need occasionally. That's a prohibitively expensive. So the challenge is how do you meet the intermittency challenge from renewables? And of course, nuclear could be part of that. Probably natural gas with carbon capture, but that can't go in everywhere. One would anticipate as well connecting grids across the country in a way that they aren't today. But we have a huge problem, basically. And of course, we can't really count on renewables to be able to fill the huge need, because they are seeing land use challenges. 16 of 19 counties in Iowa prohibit installation of solar facilities. So they want to preserve their historic agricultural background. To bring power to load means building transmission lines, which is a decade or more long process, if you can do it at all, in the United States under current law. So you have huge problems that my view is that basically we need to be doing everything we can with regard to a whole series. We shouldn't take anything off the table. And so the thought is that perhaps renewable can help to play the role. And I've talked about the need to decarbonize across the whole economy, not just the electrical part of the economy. Now, a lot of US companies are considering advanced reactors. They're not interested in the gigawatt scale reactors like the Vogtle plant that's just going in because of the cost and schedule delays. But there's a lot of thought about advanced reactors. What am I talking about? I'm talking about light water reactors that are small, typically have passive safety features, unlike the current generation of reactors that allow on electrically driven pumps and valves and so forth to actuate safety systems. Passive safety systems rely on natural phenomena, pressure, temperature variance, gravity, as a means to meet the safety functions. They're simpler. And the promise of advanced reactors is that they have the possibility of increased safety. First of all, they're smaller, so the source term is smaller. Many of the reactors operate at low pressure or close to atmospheric pressure. So you don't have the propulsive forces that exist with current reactors to inject radionuclides and debris into the atmosphere. So they have a promise of safety, but it's got to be shown because there are increased risks as well. If you've got a sodium-cooled reactor, you have to worry about sodium water, sodium air interactions that you don't have to worry about today. If you have a molten salt-cooled reactor, you have to worry about excessive corrosion in all of the piping. You have to worry about the possibility that the salt in a downtime will freeze, and that's happened with some Russian reactors. So you have some other issues you're going to have to deal with. Of course, the most important factor for the companies and for the vendors is they all promise that they'll be much lower cost than existing reactors. It's got to be proven. And they anticipate much shorter construction times. The reactor designs should be simpler. And in fact, they talk about factory construction. So you have the cost advantages that we get throughout the rest of our economy with regard to serial production of products, learning curve kinds of examples to drive down costs. And they believe that that will be possible with these small reactors as well. And of course, much less site work, because you will take them from the factory to the site. You won't have to do the basically stick-built process that we use now for reactors. It has to be proven, and beyond that, if you're going to build a factory to produce reactors, you need to have enough orders to justify building the factory. So we have a chicken and egg problem here, is that until somebody has the orders that are necessary to justify a factory, it's going to be very hard to invest in one. Of course, I've talked about uses beyond energy. I later talk about higher thermal efficiency. Many of these reactors operate at higher temperature. So the heat that they produce is much more valuable. There's a possibility of using it at the higher temperature heat to replace fossil sources of heat for chemical processing, for example, with, of course, hydrogen being the one that everyone is most interested now as a way to build synthetic fuels to replace carbon fuels that we need, or perhaps we'll need certainly for aircraft, and likely need for heavy trucking and so forth. They claim increased operational flexibility. remains to be seen. There is restrictions on basically the ramp rate for existing nuclear reactors, how fast you can bring them up and down in power. And if you have a fluctuating grid, you need to have a capacity to be able, the flexibility to move that power up and down quickly. You're not going to be able to do it on seconds or minutes, but you certainly ought to do it in tens of minutes. And there is greater capacity for faster ramp speeds with many of these smaller reactors. If it's a fast reactor, you have greater fuel utilization, that you're going to burn the fuel much deeper. So currently, US power plants have to replace a part of their core every 18 months to 24 months. Most plants, most pressurized water reactors, it's every 18 months. With the fast reactors, you have a much longer lived core. So you have to bring it down to refuel much more seldom. In fact, some of them are talking about lifetime cores of the type we have for submarines, for example. And I'll come for a minute and talk about deployment. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. I know that's an eye test for most of you. It just describes there are, in the US, about 15 or 20 vendors that are pursuing advanced reactors of various types around the world. There are probably 40 or 50. A lot of them are small, but many of them have attracted billions of dollars of funding to pursue these reactors, and there's obviously very serious interest in them. They obviously, I've mentioned the small modular, light water, small modular reactors. Those will be the earliest to come online. But there are others that are sodium-cooled, gas-cooled with helium as the coolant, or molten salt. Those are all active designs that vendors in the United States are pursuing. And they're both thermal reactors and fast reactors. Every variant that's sort of imaginable is something that somebody is pursuing. Now, we envision that there will be lots of deployment scenarios that are possible. I've talked about the factory production, being able to much faster production, hopefully with cost reductions. And they have they're certain to have, because of their safety features, much capacity for relaxation of the NRC siting requirements, emergency planning zones, as a result of the fact that they're not expected, or it has to be shown, that they will not have widespread impacts in the event of a severe accident. And so people are talking about at least some fossil sites. Typically a coal plant you're shutting down might be repowered with a nuclear plant. Now, that's attractive for many reasons. One is that there's existing transmission lines that exist into those plants, and they have cooling water. And they have a population that's nearby that's been trained to operate at least a power plant. A lot of those people have to be retrained. But for the back end of the plant is similar to that for a fossil plant. So you have workers there who want to work, continue to work in a utility. So you have this possibility. It's a very attractive proposition, if you can do it, to repower existing fossil sites that you take out of service as you decarbonize. There's great current interest in microreactors. These are reactors from 1 to 10 megawatts. Very small reactors. Some you could carry around in the back of a truck, large truck, that you could put in and use for emergency power in an area that has a problem. They could be used perhaps for charging for electric vehicles on a turnpike, wherever, that might have difficulty having the necessary power capacity that's available. Or you have congestion on the transmission system at various nodes, where you just don't have enough power to be able to serve everything that's being served from a node. You could put a microreactor there to augment power supply in those situations. There even are proposals, it's an MIT group that's pursuing the idea, that we just replace all these large plants and put microreactors all over the place. maybe even autonomously operated microreactors that have, are alleged to have inherent safety features associated with them that would make that possible. That's a stretch, obviously, but at least there are people who are talking about it. And then there's also groups that talk about building reactors that are offshore, have the virtue of it's an offshore reactor. You've got effectively an infinite cooling source that's immediately available. And you could put it offshore of an existing site. Many, of course, reactors are right on the sea. Many other power plants are because of the need for cooling water. And you could use existing transmission infrastructure by running cables into the shore and avoid a lot of the siting problems that power plants of all types, and particularly nuclear plants, have. So there's a whole series of different kinds of deployment scenarios that may make advanced reactors attractive. But I think the main point of my talk is that there are many, many challenges that have to be overcome, and we need to get on with dealing with them if we're going to have advanced reactors contribute in the time frame in which they're needed. Key one is establishing economic competitiveness. Existing reactors, as I indicated, are ones that are incredibly reliable. And they need to continue to operate if we're going to be able to meet our carbon goals. But people are not interested in paying the dollars per kilowatt that existing reactors have. It just is not competitive with anything else. So that you need to be able to bring that cost down to show that they are competitive with the full range of services that they can provide. That probably means $2,000 to $4,000 a kilowatt. And that's going to be a real stretch to be able to do that. And I've mentioned, they shouldn't be licensed. They shouldn't be installed unless you can establish that they're safe, particularly in the novel types of deployment scenarios that are envisioned. That if you're going to have something that is not at a remote site as required for existing nuclear plants, you need to make sure that you really do understand the consequences of the likelihood of a severe accident is small and the consequences are small. There's a huge problem, not only, I mentioned the factory chain problem with regard to small modular reactors. That applies through the whole supply chain. Many of the reactors are intended to use high assay, low enriched uranium. Current reactors use fuel that's enriched to 4 or 5%. In order to get the performance they want, many of these reactors are talking about fuel that's enriched to 19%. Anything above 20% is highly enriched uranium, and it is very strictly controlled. And that's a real problem right now. So we don't have any fuel facility in the United States that can produce high-assay, low-enriched uranium today. There's a major effort by DOE to fund creation of such facilities, get them started anyway, build the centrifuges to enable them to do the enrichment. But we don't have that today. And many of them are proceeding with the idea that they might have demonstrations early in the next decade of these plants because they were dependent on fuel from Russia. And that's not going to happen. So, and of course, all of the specialized pumps and other equipment, no factory is going to invest on developing a supply chain unless they see sufficient orders. So the chicken and egg problem that I talked about with regard to factory construction of plants applies through the whole supply chain associated with them. And of course, you've got to remember, for nuclear plants, there are special quality assurance requirements that need to be satisfied. It's much more expensive to meet those quality assurance requirements than, even though it might be components that are similar to ones that are commercially available, meeting the quality assurance requirements is expensive. I've talked about the need to decarbonize across the economy. A lot of those things need to be demonstrated, particularly a big effort by DOE right now to show to have various sites or centers to be able to produce hydrogen That's a very attractive, probably one of the most attractive applications for nuclear because it produces both the electricity and the high temperature heat, which makes the electrolyzers more efficient, prospect of very efficient electrolyzers. But there's development, technology that needs to be developed to do that, and of course it has to be proven. You may wonder, well, what happened at Vogtle? Why did it cost so much? Why did it take so long? And quite frankly, there's a problem in the United States on mega projects of all kinds. Many of them come in vastly over budget and long delayed. Look at the major rail lines and bridges. And these major projects, it's a characteristic problem. We need to learn how to manage these projects much better than we have. It's not a unique problem to nuclear, but it's a particularly aggravated one right now. Of course, the regulatory framework is designed for light water reactors. Understandably, that's what we use. And so, as you move to different types of coolants, different kinds of scenarios that present risk, there's a need for changing the whole regulatory apparatus in order to be able to accomplish this. The NRC has been striving to build a technology-independent, performance-based, risk-based regulatory system. The existing regulations are fundamentally deterministic analyses. Before probabilistic risk analyses were developed with sophistication. And there's an overlay of PRA adjustments to them to make them more risk-informed and to actually add some safety scenarios that weren't part of the deterministic analyses. But there's a whole new framework that needs to be built. NRC is dealing with this in an ad hoc way right now because many of these vendors are coming to the NRC seeking approval for their designs, but it's basically one-offs, and then approval of exemptions as the way to allow them to proceed. That's what's happened for NuScale, which is one of these light water reactors, light water cooled reactors that actually has received a certified design to proceed, but it's through a whole series of exemptions that took away regulatory requirements that otherwise would apply after deep analysis by the NRC that it was appropriate to do so. Because there's a continuing issue with social acceptance. That's not something the nuclear industry has handled very well. My perception is that attitudes towards nuclear power are changing in the United States and around the world, that a population that was much more hostile to nuclear before is now inclined to be more accepting. But a serious accident would change that. I don't think it's necessarily a deeply held belief. And the nuclear industry has not been very effective at its dealing with local communities and dealing honestly and accurately with the concerns that they raise. So that's something, it's not only a nuclear industry, but it's the regulator as well has got to deal with the social acceptance problem. And you have to recognize there's some places that are never going to accept nuclear power and don't try. Of course, I've talked about safety, which has been a lot of my focus. Associated with safety is the need to assure safeguards requirements and ensure the security of the plants from intentional malevolent acts. Those should all be included in the designs of the plants. There's opportunities to do things in the design that you should build into the reactors right from the beginning. If there's a shortcoming, I think, on the existing vendors is that they're familiar with the NRC's focus on safety and to a lesser extent on security, but are not familiar with the international requirements on safeguards. We're a weapons state. They've never really had to worry about safeguards requirements in the United States to the extent that that's required in other countries. And there are a series of obligations that come with the reactor that's built in other countries that arise from the protocols that are required by the IAEA that will have to be satisfied. And that's something that you need to consider and build into the plant rather than do expensive retrofits. Key ingredient, I believe, is establishing international markets. If you're going to build a factory, you need to be building lots of units. And you need to therefore, international markets are going to be essential for these designs to succeed. And you have a challenge there in that the Russians have been very effective in marketing. Many of the existing reactors built around the world over half are being built by the Russians. It's the reason that they subsidize the plants. Is they recognize if they build a nuclear plant in a country, they have opportunities for engagement in that country over perhaps the next 100 years in an aspect of its critical infrastructure. So they see a foreign policy advantage to pursuing and subsidizing their nuclear activities. We have not been thinking about that at all. And in fact, for a long time, the World Bank would not fund nuclear projects. So, I mean, we need to think much more deeply about how we engage internationally. There are a whole series of legal requirements that need to be satisfied, that need to be streamlined. But developing up capacity for these vendors to succeed in international marketing is going to be part of the necessary tools to have them be successful in the United States. And it's an area where a lot needs to be done. And of course, the abiding Achilles heel for nuclear is waste. Advanced reactors aren't going to solve that problem. Fast reactors have the opportunity for a deeper burn and perhaps for waste that doesn't have to be isolated as long from the environment as the light water fuel. But nonetheless, this is a problem that has been accumulating, and we're making no progress on addressing it in the United States, and I see no prospect that we will anytime soon. This is a problem we are leaving for our children and grandchildren to solve. It's not a technical problem. Deep isolation geologic isolation of waste will certainly isolate it from the environment for the necessary long periods of time. But we have a social, political inability to deal with this issue. And we have to face it at some point. And that's going to be particularly the case if we build more nuclear plants. Although obviously we have accumulated waste from the whole history of the nuclear power program that is a legacy that has to be solved in any event. So I've had to race through this. I wanted to leave a few minutes, literally just a few minutes, for questions. I should apologize. I had a disaster occur this morning. I got up and my hearing aids didn't work. So if you have a question, I'd love to receive some, but I may have to have Fred help me respond to them.
Let's thank Richard.
Yes, thank you very much. After mentioning all the problems with financing nuclear power, you dismissed batteries as being too expensive, while they don't have any of those other problems, the safety, the waste. Could you give us some numbers that would compare the price of batteries to the price of a comparable nuclear power plant?
Yeah, the question had to do with comparing with batteries. It's a moving target, that battery prices are changing all the time. There are issues associated with the materials that are in batteries, that nickel, cobalt, that are in batteries that are going to be a challenge, and their availability is an issue today. And I think I tried to say that for diurnal changes, batteries make a lot of sense and are probably the cheapest thing to do. It's the problem that you can go weeks. We have low output. If you have a grid that is highly dependent on renewables, you can go weeks where you don't have adequate supply from the renewables. And so you're just building more and more batteries to be able to meet them. And that's a problem. I don't care how much they cost. At some stage, unless their cost is minuscule, to have a battery bank that you only use once a year, it just becomes prohibitively expensive. But it's a changing picture.
Thank you, Dr. Mazur, for your very comprehensive list of challenges that you posed expertly about advanced reactors. But there's one challenge that I think hasn't been considered yet, It's about the system of advanced reactors, which is, as you mentioned a number of times, you have to have a manufacturing system in order to reduce the cost. You have to have a supply chain, so you have to have factories, factory assembly, and so on to address that problem. Now, when you have mass manufacturing, it does lower cost, but it comes with a risk that has not been addressed, which is you look at the Boeing Dreamliner, you look at the Toyota, you look at a Ford. When you mass manufacture, there's a risk of recalls. What happens if you discover a problem like the Boeing Dreamliner battery and you have 500 NuScale reactors? Not hypothetical, because the NuScale reactor has been given an exemption for its helical steam generator, as you know, not advisedly in my opinion, but that apart. What do you do if you find you have a common design problem like the Boeing Dreamliner or the Boeing MAX 737, and you have to recall a radioactive reactor?
Well, that is a serious question that does have to be addressed. I mean, I think you have the problem, you have this problem actually today, in that there are 3 eras of reactors in France. And there's one of those reactors, it turns out, is having all kinds of stress corrosion problems with the heads. And so you had a problem with significant part of the French nuclear fleet had to be brought down. And as a result of the fact that they have standardized, and you have the risks that arise from standardization. I think it's a problem that we have throughout our economy where you get the benefits of serial production, is that you have the risk that there's something you hadn't anticipated. It does mean, I think, that very high stringency has to be undertaken in the design to be able to anticipate as well as you can all the possible failure modes. And also to try to design the reactor if you can so that if there is a failure, it's a soft failure, that it doesn't bring a calamity along with it. So I think that there is, and of course there are the small reactors, of course, do have a smaller source term, so they have some other advantages as well. But you do raise a problem. It has to be seriously considered by the regulator in the quality assurance that they require in the manufacturer and the depth of the analyses that they undertake.
Hi, I have 2 questions. The first one is, do you think we can overcome these challenges and how quickly? And the second is, do you have some thoughts about how the physics community might contribute to solving some of those challenges?
My reason for actually for giving this talk, as much as anything, is to indicate that we have this array of challenges, I think any one of which might well be fatal to reliance on advanced reactors. And if we're serious about them, we now need to get moving on seeing if we can address them. And so the thrust of this talk was to make the case. This is an area where a lot of depth of work needs to be done by many people to deal with these problems. The Department of Energy intends to invest huge amounts of money in demonstrations of these reactors. Well, that's great. They may show you can build 1 or 2 of these reactors. But unless you can show you can build a lot of them and build them cheaply, they're going to die. And so we need a lot more thought about how you take them to the next stage of commercialization. I should have thought about things that physicists could do to address these issues. I think that I don't see in any of these particular problems, I mean, there are technical problems that physicists definitely could help in terms of the applications beyond electricity generation that have all kinds of technical engineering, chemistry problems associated with them, some of them rather deep, that need to be resolved. There's a lot of work that nuclear engineers and physicists are doing on the technical problems with the reactors themselves. So I don't see necessarily the need for more energy there. If we could mobilize more people to realize that advanced reactors could be part of the solution, and we need to address these problems, I think physicists would be appropriate to speak out on that issue.
I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt because we keep the schedule, but I just want to say thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Laura Greco. She's the research director and a senior scientist in the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. A physicist by training, she works at the intersection of science and policy on a variety of topics related to defense policy. She's an internationally recognized expert on nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space security. In addition to her own work on these issues, she has also devoted substantial effort to engaging others, especially young people, on these issues. Laura is a fellow of the APS and a member of its panel on public affairs. She is also an associate editor of the journal Science and Global Security. Laura is this year's recipient of the APS Leo Szilard Award, which recognizes outstanding accomplishments by physicists in promoting the use of physics for the benefit of society in such areas as the environment, arms control, and science policy. Laura received this award for significant, influential analyses of critical issues in international security and arms control, especially in the areas of missile defense, space weapons, and space security, and also for sustained activities educating students, colleagues, policy experts, and the public about these issues. She's going to speak to us today about the growing danger of nuclear weapons and what physicists can do about it. Please help me welcome Laura.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm greatly honored to receive an award bearing the name of Leo Szilard, who's a personal hero of mine. He did so much to advocate for nuclear arms control, and I will come back to his work later in my talk. I'm honored, too, to be in the company of so many esteemed colleagues who have previously received this honor, a number of whom are in this room today. And one of the co-founders of the organization I've worked at for the last 2 decades, Kurt Gottfried, was also a recipient, and Kurt just passed away last August. It's inspiring and humbling company indeed, and I'm really proud to be associated with this group of people. As some of you know, my name is Laura Greco, and as Fred mentioned, I've devoted much of my career as a physicist to working on nuclear security issues. I hope today to talk a bit about what I've been working on and why I believe it is so important for scientists and citizens to become more involved in reducing the threat posed by nuclear weapons. I am personally a strong believer in what you can do, you must do. And so today I'm going to talk a bit about what you must do and end up, hopefully, with a good mandate for what you can do. And I really do think that physicists have not only a responsibility, but a real capacity to engage in this set of issues. So I wanted to begin by focusing on what I think is a pretty remarkable complacency in the face of what I see as fundamentally unacceptable risks posed by the world's nuclear weapons. At present, there are 9 countries in the world that possess nuclear weapons, and they're on this image here. The US and Russia own 90% of those. So it's important to note that the center of gravity of that problem is really with the United States and Russia. As for total numbers, according to the latest estimates, there are some 12,700 nuclear warheads in the world today, of which 9,400 are in active military stockpiles. Given that a single nuclear weapon can destroy a major city and kill millions of people, and that dozens of such weapons could end a functioning society, complacency about the state of affairs seems particularly misguided. I'm a member of Generation X. I grew up in a world still caught under the nuclear shadow of the Cold War. Many of the popular culture touchstones in my childhood directly acknowledged concerns about the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. I was just after the generation that did duck and cover, but we had a lot of this. This was a present, everyday way of thinking for us during the Cold War. I've recently observed that people in generations a bit younger than mine, I am deeply appreciative about their commitment to reducing the terrible risks caused by the climate change emergency. But I see less commitment or less awareness about nuclear weapons. Although I have to say, I read polling yesterday after I prepared my talk, which noted it was a survey of US citizens, and 66% of US citizens are somewhat or very concerned about nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons will end the human race. 66% of people, and that was the top threat. That was above climate change, above artificial intelligence, pandemics. They even asked about alien invasion, which thankfully was very low. And 70% of people think that it's actually likely that nuclear weapons will do this. So, and when they broke it out by age group, it was common between an older generation that had gone through these events and the younger generation. So we're all concerned. So why are we not doing enough? So one of the works, as Fred mentioned, one of the things that I do professionally is really to try to engage people to deeply look at this problem and think about what they can contribute. So how urgent are these issues today? How real is the threat? Are the perceptions correct? Well, I think that they are. Let's start with the full-blown war that's raging in Ukraine now into its second year. Since Russia invaded Ukraine last February and suffered significant casualties, Russian policymakers, Russian officials have fanned fears that President Putin might resort to using a nuclear weapon should other states try to intervene. And those fears have not diminished as Russian setbacks have accumulated and the war has not gone as Putin has planned. Senior Russian military leaders have reportedly discussed how they might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The protracted war is also raising the risk that nuclear-armed countries, including the United States and NATO countries, may be drawn into direct conflict with each other. Last fall, President Joe Biden reckoned, and I think it's accurate, that these developments had brought the world closer to nuclear Armageddon than any time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's enormous suffering because of the conventional war that's still ongoing in Ukraine, but this crisis has also brought front and center the grave global threat posed by the deliberate use of nuclear weapons in warfare, something that has long been thought unthinkable. And at the same time, the guardrails are being dismantled. Russia announced in February that it is suspending participation in the new START treaty, which is the only remaining treaty constraining Russian and American nuclear weapons. This has resulted in the stopping of regular exchange of information, on-site inspections, and the bilateral consultations between the two countries, which had been useful to continue to keep these relationships going. But the truth is, the world's nuclear weapons, even not in times of war, pose an unacceptable threat to our lives. Before I move on, I just wanted to give you one additional example that made a big impression on me. All of us who watched the insurrection that took place on January 6, 2021 understood the threat it posed to our democracy. But many others of us who are close nuclear watchers kept an eye on something else as well. As you can see clearly in the photo on the left, the US president is accompanied at all times by a briefcase called the nuclear football. And the same is true for the US vice president. The briefcase contains a book that lists a menu of prepared nuclear options for different scenarios. The president also carries a card about the size of a credit card called the biscuit that contains the codes used to authenticate the order if it's called into the Pentagon in Strategic Command. January 6th really brought home to us particularly one problematic aspect of our current system of nuclear command and control, and that's the immense and unchallengeable power vested in the president. The president alone has the sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. He or she has no requirement to get agreement from anyone or even to consult anyone, though of course we assume that they would with such a grave decision. And yet the members of the military are bound by the Uniform Code of Military Justice to follow orders provided they're legal and have come from competent authority. And so the threat that this system posed by the chaos surrounding the extraordinary insurrection on January 6th can't be ignored. The insurrectionists were within 100 feet from the vice president at one point. As Bob Woodward reported in his most recent book, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, even explicitly told us facts in direct contradiction of the current legal framework that any nuclear order must include him. Because the chilling reality is that once a launch order for a nuclear attack is transmitted to the war room by whomever is in possession of the nuclear football, is meant to be executed within minutes. The land-based nuclear missiles can be launched within a few. The submarines that carry enormous numbers of nuclear armed missiles also, maybe about 15 minutes. Once the missiles are launched, they cannot be recalled. As General Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA, put it, the system is designed for speed and decisiveness. It's not designed to debate the decision. So although many of you, I think, are really familiar with the history, I'll just go quickly. This is a picture of what was called the Gadget, the first nuclear explosion. Back in the 1930s, so we're coming up, we're not quite at the 100-year anniversary of the nuclear weapons, but it started about 100 years ago. It became clear that the new science that showed nuclei could be broken apart and produce copious amounts of energy could be combined with an idea that Leo Szilard had while walking the streets of London in 1933. And he thought that any kind of energy-producing nuclear reaction could be self-sustaining by using a chain reaction. So marrying those two concepts, he quickly realized that there was a potential for an enormous capability in the guise of a nuclear bomb. So he urged his colleague and friend Albert Einstein to get President Roosevelt to initiate a program to make sure the US got this weapon first before the Nazis did. So we assembled the best engineers and physicists, I think ever, to turn this theoretical science into a working weapon. The Manhattan Project produced the first nuclear explosion, and despite the efforts of many of its scientists to persuade the US military not to use it on cities and civilians, but only as a demonstration, nuclear weapons, as we know, were used in the populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands. Since that first test, the destructive power of nuclear weapons is increased by manyfold through scientific and engineering advances. Other countries followed suit in developing nuclear weapons. Enormous amounts of intellectual energy were put towards this to make weapons yields larger, to make weapons more reliable or with different attributes. The industrial process of mining and producing fissile materials changed the landscape and people's lives. Thousands of explosive tests were performed, hundreds of these above ground, mainly in areas where the population was politically dispossessed, destroying homelands and contaminating areas far from the tests and radiation. And the legacy of these activities continues to be felt by many communities. I hope that you'll be here to attend the session on Monday at 3:45, which goes into some of this history and some of these effects on communities of the development, testing, and use of nuclear weapons. So the information from those tests provided us with some good ideas about what nuclear weapons actually do. For example, here's a simulation of what would happen if a 455 kiloton nuclear weapon detonated above New York. So this size weapon is a fairly typical one of the kind carried by US submarines. And as you can see, the small red circle in the center is a fireball radius. Everything within there would be instantly vaporized. The blast over pressure from the shock wave can literally flatten buildings and infrastructure. It's likely to start widespread fires and hurt people by direct radiation effects. So this, with one weapon on a large city, you can easily kill 1 million people or more. And as you imagine, they're in just such the places where hospitals and fire stations, transportation nodes, all the types of things you'd need to recover from such an attack would also have been destroyed. So despite those duck and cover drills some of us did as a kid to hide under the desks, there's really no way to effectively prepare, and there's really no way to effectively address the effects of a nuclear weapon. A nuclear exchange, if this led to a nuclear exchange, that could lead to a cascade of horrific effects. Nuclear war could kill tens of millions from blast and fire and prompt radiation, as well as longer-term deaths from radiation-induced illness. The effects would not remain localized to the countries involved. Dozens of weapons targeted on key infrastructure could cripple economic activity and food production. We've seen even the effects of a conventional war really disturbing, and a pandemic, disturbing our distribution nodes. We're a very connected world. Attacks on cities can set fires under some circumstances, and under some circumstances, those could produce a firestorm and loft soot into the upper atmosphere. If that soot persists, it could decrease sunlight received at the surface and lower land and ocean temperatures, which could further inhibit our ability to feed ourselves and cause further death and suffering. So my aim here is not to depress you. This is a part in the talk where everybody does get sad and depressed because it is cataclysmic. But I do want us to be able to look really clear-eyed with a scientific perspective about what these weapons actually do. And with that vision in mind, I'm going to take a look at sort of more specifically at US and Russian arsenals. Currently, they're constrained by agreed limits to these weapons in the New START Treaty, but you'll see that these limits still permit each country to keep enough weapons to more or less end civilization as we know it many times over. The US currently has around 1,600 weapons. So both countries are right about at the limit that they're meant to be able to maintain. Let's see, I think that, yes, sorry. So the total inventory here, you'll see, includes stockpiled and retired warheads. So those gray are waiting to be disassembled. The red are what's actively deployed, and the blue is what has been pulled off of those after the START treaty and held in reserve, and which could be uploaded should these restrictions, should the treaty fail or should it not be renewed in 2026. The US and Russia, so the bottom line is that there's more than enough destructive power to cripple us as a human civilization and to create environmental catastrophe. But beyond the sheer numbers of weapons, it's important to understand the framework within these weapons and with which they exist, the way that we've decided that they're part of our thinking and a part of our security structure. Both the US and the Soviet Union at the time were unwilling to give up these extraordinary weapons. That could have been a choice, and they'd considered it. But it held a promise of global domination. But at the same time, they were unable to secure a lasting advantage over each other, and they tried to find ways out of this, this ability. But eventually, they accepted that there was sort of de facto mutually assured destruction, that if one country launched a nuclear war, they would be suicidal, that their country would also be destroyed. But constructing theories of security based on mutually assured destruction, creating strategies of nuclear deterrence based on massive retaliation, set up sort of a dangerous dynamic. The adversary must believe that you can retaliate no matter what, creating technical demands on the forces to always be able to retaliate, and that you will retaliate no matter what, which raises enormous political, social, and moral questions. So this strategy had at least two consequential effects. One which is that we've accumulated those enormous nuclear arsenals, as I mentioned, but they've also been coupled with a variety of offensive delivery systems. The nuclear triad includes 3 delivery platforms that have long formed the core of nuclear arsenals: land-based missiles, submarine-based missiles, and bomber aircrafts that carry gravity bombs, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. While it seems like, sort of post facto, that there's lots of explanations why we need all 3 of these, a lot of the reason this happened was because of bureaucratic rivalries rather than a thought-out security structure. So much of what you'll hear is sort of post facto justification for how we've organized this. To try to escape the mutual vulnerability, states have pursued missile defense systems to try to protect against the ballistic missiles, which has ironically created incentives to build more missiles. This also spurred innovations in delivery vehicles that can get around missile defenses. But this concern about keeping your delivery systems safe and able to retaliate has led to a couple of this consequence that we have short time scales for decision making, because missiles sit in fixed knowable locations and thus are vulnerable to a preemptive attack. The US and Russia have developed systems that allow these land-based nuclear missiles to be launched almost instantaneously upon warning of an attack. The idea is you get the missiles up and out of the ground before they can be destroyed. So as I alluded to earlier, that means with nuclear weapons are on essentially hair trigger alert, ready to be launched immediately. Leaders will generally have roughly 10 minutes for deliberation and decision making about whether to launch a counterattack. And that is one reason why we have a sole authority policy. So if, for example, if Russia launched an attack, first you'd recognize it with satellite-based infrared detectors. Military command would be notified of that first phenomena. The president is notified, assembles advisors, and has to make a decision to launch those missiles or not. It's set up as a sort of use it or lose it. The launch, if the president decides to do so, the launch message is received, missiles are fired, and the Russian bombs detonate unless it was a false alarm. So these enormous consequences, which I outlined previously, these could potentially happen within an hour, half an hour. So the actual decision times could be much less, depending on the scenarios. So how did we meet these dangers? We've survived, thankfully. And what are the ways that we've tried to put limits on this machine that we've created? One of them is arms control. So despite enormous difficulties, there's ample evidence that arms control and public involvement in these issues have made an important difference. I like this picture so much because this is a picture of the Russian and US bilateral consultative commission that meets to resolve any questions, technical discrepancies around the implementation of the New START treaty. So it requires face-to-face conversations. The existing New START treaty, as I mentioned, which caps the number of delivery vehicles and weapons, includes really fairly intrusive verification procedures, going to look at each other's delivery vehicles, notifications, observations. So it has been quite a stabilizing feature of the system. And it has worked. These ways of doing arms control have worked. So you'll see these massive nuclear arsenals that during the Cold War, we built more and more trying to get around this mutual assured destruction. And we're able to start to mitigate that problem by really painstakingly negotiated arms control treaties. And rather than going too much into specific treaties, I wanted to just mention how scientists have gotten engaged in this, because I do want you to see yourselves in this story. For example, many of the people who've received the Szilard Award in the past have contributed in critical ways. In 1959, Linus Pauling led a scientist campaign in the US to end atmospheric nuclear explosive tests, and Andrei Sakharov lobbied Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. This led to the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which kept nuclear tests out of the atmosphere, in space, and undersea. And Pauling won the Nobel Prize for this effort. In response to the US proposal to build ballistic missile defenses, which clearly threatened to cause an offense-defense competition, Richard Garwin and Hans Bethe published seminal work in the public domain to show that there is ultimately no workable defense. This helped pave way for the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972 and other follow-on arms control treaties. Physicists also organized in the 1980s around missile defenses when Reagan unveiled his Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, to plan to build massive defenses, including in space. And the American Physical Society has contributed landmark technical studies on missile defense issues and continues to do so today. More recently, in the 1980s and 90s, a group of US and Soviet physicists led by Evgeny Velikov and Tom Cochrane demonstrated how independent seismic monitoring could be used to verify a ban on nuclear testing, paving the way for the negotiation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Other ways that have really influenced our ability to have survived this has been public resistance and advocacy. Since the 1950s, Dr. Martin Luther King insisted that the Black freedom struggle in America was intimately connected to the nuclear disarmament struggle. And Coretta Scott King worked on this issue since she was in college. She was always committed. In the 1980s, Randall Forsberg famously galvanized a grassroots movement in the US called the Nuclear Freeze Movement, with a simple call for a bilateral halt between the US and Soviet Union on all nuclear weapons production, deployment, and testing. And in June 1982, 1 million people gathered in New York Central Park to support the Nuclear Freeze Movement, and in doing so created significant pressure for President Reagan and Congress to engage on these issues. And there's a new book on this rally just out this month called Saving the World from Nuclear War by Dr. Vincent Intanti. I hope you'll take the time to read that. And most recently, a broad group of governments and civil society organizations came together to negotiate the landmark Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or what is now referred to as the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. This effort included many activists and scientists from communities impacted by nuclear testing, such as in the Marshall Islands and in the US Southwest, as well as from other countries, all of whom understand that even if they happen to live in nuclear weapons-free zones, their lives will be affected by nuclear war that occurs anywhere in the world. Together, they have forcefully advocated around the humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons. The resulting treaty, which has entered into force, is the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons. The civil society organization which led this effort, ICANN, won the Nobel Prize for this effort in 2017. So in other words, we've seen time and time again, timely technical research, public mobilization can be remarkably effective in spurring steps toward a safer world. So in light of the problem I outlined and the solutions, what can we do today? Well, I mean, the first thing I'd urge you, and I hope that you walk away from this talk with nothing else then I've nudged you to take a step or to stop being complacent, because there are things we can do. I just briefly want to mention, this is a picture of Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard. I'm really inspired, and I want to just take a moment to acknowledge his legacy, because Szilard was not only a very inventive and brilliant scientist, he was a powerful advocate and a creative political thinker. He organized aid to refugee scientists. He enlisted Nobel laureates to protest the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. He got his famous friends, such as Einstein, to use their access to high-level policymakers to lobby for safer policies. He literally invented the notion of classified research by pushing colleagues not to publish research on nuclear science when they might lead to nuclear weapons. He brought scientist colleagues to lobby Congress. He created public information campaigns by scientists to educate the public. He wrote to Stalin and proposed radio broadcasts between the countries. He used his access to a meeting with Khrushchev to get an agreement for a USSR nuclear hotline. He was always thinking, always trying new things. He was never complacent. I'm going to urge you, get involved with your professional society, APS studies, volunteer for committees. You can see a number of the talks at this meeting show physicists in action on these issues. I've been privileged to serve on the APS panel on public affairs, which grapples with these, and to work with my colleagues James Wells and Fred Lamb on a POPA Commission study on missile defense. Shift a portion of your research agenda to work on such issues. Take a year sabbatical to work in Congress. There are a number of things. Get involved with some of the organizations I'll mention at the end, which can help you engage with your policymakers, write your op-eds, write your letters. Before I close, and as Richard said about climate change, there's no silver bullet, really, it's silver buckshot. We have lots of different ways we can get at this problem. So I'm just going to mention, so what's the plan? What are things you can do today? Obviously, speak out, talk to people that you know, speak out in the public about using or threatening to use nuclear weapons, because that is becoming, we don't want that normalized, especially in the context of Ukraine war, sign on letters. We can work with my organizations, two of them that I work with have been working to get the US to declare a policy that the US will never use nuclear weapons first. I think this common sense policy could reduce the likelihood of a nuclear conflict by making it clear that US nuclear weapons are only to deter a nuclear attack and never for offensive purposes. We think it could reduce tensions between countries, lessen others' fears of a possible preemptive nuclear attack, and perhaps lead other nations to adopt it as well. Should such a policy become US policy and taken seriously and implemented, the nuclear weapons arsenals could be tailored and much reduced. We're also pressing to change the current sole authority policy in the United States that vests the power to launch nuclear weapons solely in the President of the United States by including a number of other advisors in that decision-making process. It's also, I believe, important for democracy. Such a consequential decision shouldn't be made by one person, and should be made in the most thoughtful and deliberate method possible. My organization is doing an event next month that goes through some of these options. I'd be happy to talk about how you can get to see that. We also press for vigorous nuclear diplomacy. We are at a crisis point where arms control treaties are either being abandoned or slowly dismantled. It's really important to maintain these guardrails, especially when countries have conflicts. Things we can encourage the United States to continue to respect the limits of the New START treaty as long as Russia does. Make sure that we continue to have channels where we talk to each other. And we can rein in the $1 trillion plan to recapitalize the US nuclear arsenal. So as part of the deal for getting the Senate to accept the New START treaty in 2010, President Obama agreed to a modernization program to overhaul the existing nuclear weapons arsenal. The plan is currently calling for the US to spend $1 trillion to build new land-based ICBMs, submarines, and bombers, as well as to modernize the existing nuclear weapons. This investment clearly conflicts with the long-term goal of reducing and eventually eliminating our dependence on nuclear weapons for security. So I want to end by encouraging you all here, before going back to your labs, in your offices, in your classrooms, in your work, to pledge to yourselves to find one way to take at least one small step in the coming weeks and months to engage in these issues, And I'd be happy to talk about questions or other ways that you can get involved. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. The floor is open for questions.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, sorry,
yeah,
I can.
There's now a lot of development going on around hypersonic missiles, and I'm wondering, you know, how does that affect the stability of the current? I mean, SLBMs, I guess, have 10 minutes, so I don't know that you could do better than that. But what is the status of that, and how is that affecting the current?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, how does the development of hypersonic delivery vehicles, which are generally thought to be sort of maneuvering, the general model currently is a glide vehicle is launched on a ballistic missile to high speeds, and then it dives back down into the atmosphere and is highly maneuverable. So its main characteristic is that it is maneuverable within the atmosphere. Those have been assigned all sorts of other qualities, as you sort of alluded to, that they're faster than ballistic missiles. They're really, you know, not competitive with the fastest way of delivering nuclear weapons. So it doesn't compress timelines in that sense. The other concerns is that you couldn't see them. Well, you can see the launch of a ballistic missile. You can, the traversing of a high-speed craft through the atmosphere does generate a large thermal signal, which can be, you know, observed with a tailored, you know, infrared sensor. So they wouldn't be invisible. And the other concern people have is that they can't be stopped by missile defenses. And we haven't built, the current ballistic missile defenses are not a good match for those craft. They're not a great match either for ballistic missiles, but they're especially not a good match for hypersonics. That's because they weren't designed to. So I don't think it fundamentally changes the dynamic that we are vulnerable, because we are to each other. So it doesn't make us more vulnerable in that sense. But I think what you landed on is that introducing complexity and other things to think about, other delivery systems, just makes the problem potentially more challenging to you know, stability. So yes.
Okay, thanks for the talk. So the things you mentioned that what we could actually do, all of these things are topics that could easily be gotten around by some government official that decides that they want to launch a nuclear weapon, or that the president needs to launch a nuclear weapon. So I mean, while this is a good idea, I don't think in practice that these things can actually work. Like the only thing that can actually work is the removal of nuclear weapons. So have you like given up on this option? Or because all the things that you list are not actually destroying any nuclear weapons, they're just like eliminating the use of them. Limiting the use of them?
Thank you. That's a great question. So most of what I talked about here were risk reduction measures, which are designed to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons would be used while they currently exist. But there weren't a lot of disarmament and abolition, except for the arms control questions, which is really meant to slow those down. So you're right. They're both. I think they're both important, and there are other pieces to talk about. Some of you know, I think it's a long road to abolition, and you know, we have this ban treaty now with the explicit goal of nuclear abolition. None of the nuclear-armed countries are signatories, and most of them are pretty much ignoring its existence. But I think what its value may do is force countries to say, how do we wean ourselves off of our dependence on nuclear weapons as absolute guarantee of security? So that conceptual change has to happen, I think, before disarmament. So,
okay,
thanks for your question.
Yeah, I think we'll have to move on probably.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker today, James Wells. He's a professor of physics at the University of Michigan, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a fellow of APS. James' research interests include theoretical high-energy physics and the intersections of science and national security policy. A former chair of the APS Panel on Public Affairs, affectionately known as POPA, James co-led the 2018 study titled Neutrons for the Nation, Discovery and Applications While Minimizing the Risk of Nuclear Proliferation. James is currently a resident visiting scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's Center for Global Security Research. The title of his talk today is nuclear reactor safeguarding with neutrino detection. So we're moving now to thinking about non-proliferation efforts. Please help me in welcoming James.
I guess I click here. Start. All right, thanks very much. I very much appreciate being in this esteemed company, and congratulations to the 2 award winners. Fantastic talks, learned a lot, and really appreciate being part of this session with you and with the audience. I want to just start off with saying something about FPS. A long time ago, a couple of very influential people told me that I should work, if I have interest, about 10% of my time in physics for society, basically. So John Holdren has this famous line that he told me years ago, that you should tithe 10% of your efforts for direct help to society. And Homer Neal, who was a very influential scientist at the University of Michigan and elsewhere, had the same approach to research and physics and life. He was a former president of APS and influenced many people positively in this regard. And so I wholeheartedly endorse the words of Dr. Grego earlier on this front. This talk is about nuclear reactor safeguarding. It was mentioned in one of the bullet points in the first talk as a major issue when thinking of new designs and detectors in nuclear reactors, and about nuclear safeguarding as an interesting and important topic for scientists and engineers to study. There's been a lot of work on this, a rich history in this topic. In order to work in this area, one needs to commune with the experts, and so I want to give thanks to the bottom right-hand corner to these people who I've been working with, a nuclear scientist at Arizona, physicists at University of Michigan Engineering, and Livermore Lab, some experts in this area. And so we appreciate all their insights and help in discussion on this. Any mistakes I make are not theirs. All right, so now there we go. So 2 slides. This is an undergraduate-friendly discussion today, and so 2 slides will definitely be undergraduate-friendly, and I hope they all will be. Reactor Physics 101. U-235 fission creates antineutrinos. That's a good start. That's sort of a NOVA special start. So adding a neutron to a U-235 creates fission, and roughly 6 antineutrinos come out in the decay chain, of course, also with some neutrons. This picture shows that. The origin of this is the beta decay of bound neutrons in the neutron-rich products of the fission. So the neutron will go to a proton, electron, and an antineutrino. Well, there's a chain reaction, and we see that chain reaction in this picture, a neutron hitting a U-235. There's a chain reaction, there's fission, neutrons come out, they make more U-235, produce more antineutrinos, more neutrons, and we get nuclear reaction, nuclear bomb, and nuclear power, etc. This creates, in the process, a lot of electrons, photons, neutrons, and antineutrinos. It's about 10 to the 22 neutrinos per second. I don't know why I did that. 10 to the 22 neutrinos per second from a 3 gigawatt reactor. So lots and lots of neutrinos. This is a very well-known idea by now, decades in the making. Electrons, photons, and neutrons can all be shielded from prying eyes, but neutrinos cannot be. You can't put a lead bib on and not have neutrinos go through you. I don't know why it keeps on going forward. stepping on a clicker. I don't know. I'm in slideshow mode. I don't know how I got to slideshow mode. Yes. Okay. Well, we'll see what happens, and I'll just go back if there's a problem. So there's several reasons why somebody might want to build a neutrino detector to see the evidence of neutrinos coming out of a nuclear reactor. The most simple reason that one would think of within microseconds of hearing about this is, well, you can discover a reactor running. Well, there's better ways to doing that than neutrinos. Neutrino detectors are very expensive propositions, which we can talk about separately, maybe in the question time. And also, if you're far away from it, even though 10 to the 22 neutrinos per second sounds like a lot, very, very few of them will interact with any reasonable size detector, and so the flux of the 1 over r squared going down creates a problem of being able to discover anything clandestine happening far away. So that's not a really excellent reason to build an expensive neutrino detector. A second reason might be to check for sneaky illicit activity. And that's what we'll focus on today. And the two ideas that I talk about today are not necessarily the ones that ultimately neutrino detectors would be used for, although one of them might be. But it gives you an idea of the physics involved and some of the engineering questions involved and what's underlying the potential utility of neutrinos monitoring reactors for safeguarding. So sneaky illicit activity number one, to make weapons-grade plutonium. So here's just one picture from a paper on nuclear fuel, HEU column. That's high enriched uranium. So that's U-235 in this case being enriched to 90%, which is certainly weapons grade. Anything above 20% is weapons grade. Standard reactors, power reactors run at around 4% or so, 4 or 5%. This particular slide, it's at up to 12% is what's listed. But this is U-235. Took a lot to enrich it to 12%, and there it is. That's the fuel. There's no plutonium in this. So where does the plutonium come from, and why are reactors potentially dangerous proliferation regions? So in this slide that I showed before, there's one part in the slide that you might have noticed, and most of you are experts, so you'll know that this happens. In the process of neutron radiating U-235 and having fission, the U-238 gets radiated with neutrons, and that goes through a process that creates plutonium-239. And plutonium-239 is the bad stuff from the point of view of a nuclear weapon, and you can make plutonium-239 within the reactor core. You can reprocess the fuel later, extract it, and make a nuclear weapon out of it. Well, that's happening in all the fuels, so that's not, you can't stop that from happening. But you run the reactor a little bit differently if you want to make a plutonium bomb. And let me show you what the issue is. So plutonium-239 builds up over time. So this is a plot of basically an LEU fuel. The left-hand column is the fission fraction from various isotopes. So blue at time 0 on the x-axis is time, on time 0. The U-235 is basically 100% of the fission fraction, or near 100%. It's very large, 90-something%. And then over time, the fission fraction from U-235 drops, and while plutonium-239 increases. As plutonium-239 increases, that's where you have this possibility of extracting it later after you take the fuel out of the core. But notice that there's something else happening in this slide. Plutonium-241 is increasing. Okay, so, but it takes a little while before before 241 kicks in. And to make a nuclear weapon, you really want a much more 239 typically than 241. 241 has spontaneous fission rates, it creates problems, creates a little bit of instability on timing of a nuclear weapon. So there's a preference, especially if in your early stages of building nuclear weapons, there's a preference for wanting a very high fraction of plutonium-239. If you stared at this plot long enough, you would know what to do. You would say, if I really want a large fraction of 239 over 241, then I don't want to burn it up over its full lifetime because too much 241 comes into the game. Near the earlier stages, there's a much higher ratio, and there's an optimal time to stop the burn up. And indeed, that's what happens. These are just two places where you might stop. For full power, you might switch out fuels anywhere from 600 days, from, I don't know, a year to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. But for, if you really want to maximize your attempt to make a nuclear weapon, you would stop and exchange out the fuel sooner to get that high ratio of 239 to 241. So, but as U-235 burns up, there's fewer antineutrinos produced. And there's two reasons for that. One is you're burning up U-235. The second reason is as the fission fraction goes higher in plutonium, the output in the fission chain of plutonium is less antineutrinos on average. It's about 4 instead of 6. So you get a decline in it. So if you can monitor neutrinos carefully and their numbers carefully, you can see that the antineutrino rate stays higher than you would have expected by just purely maximizing the burn up for power generation. You actually get a different number of neutrinos. Okay, so this is a good illustration of the physics, but it's not so terribly sneaky. Again, a neutrino detector can cost hundreds of millions of dollars or more, so you wouldn't necessarily want to do that, and they might be far away. This was not how the reprocessing of the Yongbyon plant was found, was through neutrinos, for example. There are other ways to see this rapid fuel replacement than precision monitoring of antineutrinos. But I just remark parenthetically that there might be some potential advanced reactor relevance on this, because there's, especially ones with a continuous fuel loading, that this might have some relevance to it. But for the standard reactors out there right now, and what somebody might want to build, this is not the most sneaky thing that we would want to try to detect. Sneaky illicit activity 2. So this is a little bit more realistic application, is swapping out MOX fuel with LEU. So this is a reaction chart in the standard LEU fuel cycle. So U-235, which might be about 4%, so upper left-hand corner, it says it's 4%. It burns up, there's fission products, there's a little bit of U-235 that's remaining. You don't burn it all to the very end. U-235 being, U-238 being irradiated creates plutonium, including fissile plutonium that can be extracted. So that's the standard cycle. I want to go further with that. This is another plot. On the very left-hand side is that LEU fuel, 3 to 5% uranium-235 and a lot of U-238, and then you burn it up, okay? And then you have plutonium, about 1%, U-235, 1%, and then you do this reprocessing of the fuel. You pull it out, you pull off the cladding, you reprocess it. Depending on how long you burned it, the reprocessing is more or less extremely difficult, okay? And the MOX, and you can make a MOX fuel out of this. with a lot of plutonium. And this MOX fuel, then, you can burn in a reactor. There are many reactors who have fitted so that you could put MOX fuel in it. So this is, think of MOX fuel as just, it's a mixed oxide fuel. Think of it as just plutonium fuel for the purposes of this talk. So you can replace some of the fuel, maybe 30%, some reactors up to 50%, with MOX fuel and burn that down, okay? And burn the MOX fuel. Well, and including, there's the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement of US and Russia in 2000, where there's actually a goal to make plutonium fuel like this and get rid of the plutonium stocks by burning it up in these nuclear reactors. So there's legitimate reasons why you want to create this fuel and burn it up. So building on some work of Bernstein, Bowden, and Erickson, we, the collaborators at the University of Michigan and Arizona, who've been working on simulating reactor cores in a precision approximate demonstrator project with LEU fuel, which is the left column, and a MOX pin cell, which is the one that has a lot of plutonium in it, and trying to be very realistic about these fuel cells. And then investigate how sensitive can neutrinos detection be on seeing somebody pull out a MOX, instead of loading it with MOX fuel like they said they were going to, they load several percent of the fuel with LEU. And then they keep the MOX fuel and then use it and reprocess it for a nuclear weapon. That's the worst case scenario of what somebody might do, and that's what ultimately trying to safeguard against on this example. So on the left, this is a rerunning to make sure that we're on the same path. This is the LEU fuel, the standard fuel, with the burn-up of U-235, the buildup of plutonium-239, et cetera. In the MOX fuel pin on the right, the plutonium is burning down, and another plutonium fraction is increasing, and then there's uranium, which doesn't take up much of the burn fission fraction. So this is the neutrino signature of a reactor core with the same power on entirely LEU fuel versus entirely MOX fuel. And it's a scatter plot because this was done randomly through a full simulation of what a reactor is doing and what the detector sees and records. And as expected, the LEU fuel has a lot more neutrinos, and it's burning down. And the MOX fuel has fewer neutrinos and increasing slightly. Okay, so if you were to try to make a distinction between a reactor that was 100% LEU for half a year, and then 100% plutonium, it would be relatively easy to do that. But that is generally not what the safeguarding worries are as some dramatic thing like that. This is another way of plotting that Bernstein et al. Did, where they normalized the rates, counts per day, on the y-axis and showed how the rates change over time with a little bit of extra different assumptions. And the assumption in red dots are 25% plutonium fuel, MOX fuel, and the blue dots are the standard LEU fuel. Okay, so this is the comparison. Now, how would you go about seeing if somebody swapped out some of the MOX fuel and put LEU in there? Well, the first thing you want to do is look at, make a plot just to see this effect over time of 0% MOX fuel. That's the top line. I don't know if you can see my cursor. That's the top line. And that's 0% MOX fuel, and this is 100% MOX fuel. So these are the two lines from the previous plot. And then things in between, 25%, 50%, 75%, and so on. Okay, now, in this plot, this is an example of showing the difference between a MOX fuel, plutonium fuel of 22% versus 25%. And, you know, these are all simulated points over time, and it's hard. You have to really think of a statistical test that you can rely on to distinguish between these two, but this would be very hard to distinguish. On this kind of plot, it looks easy to distinguish, but if you do a full statistical test with realistic circumstances and you don't have 1,000 universes to rerun your experiment, but only one universe, then it's really hard to make that distinction. So let's try to characterize what that distinction is. So a statistical test can be created where there's a monitoring time, let's call it a capital T, and then there's a certain number of antineutrino events registered in the detector in the first half of that monitoring time, a certain number of events monitored in the second half of that monitoring time, and then create an asymmetry on it. And so this is used a lot in particle physics, and so we know this kind of statistic very well. So we construct a count asymmetry observable, where N1 minus N2 over the sum, and then in the denominator subtract out the background, whatever that background rate might be given your detector design. And with that asymmetry, then construct a Z significance statistic where the measured value of that asymmetry minus what the expectation of that would be on the declared fuel divided by the uncertainty that you would get statistically and systematically and so on from the declared fuel. So that's the statistic that we pursued, and we estimate the sensitivity by running many simulations. And then for given actual, so we assume some actual reactor core with a MOX fuel percentage, which might be different than the declared percentage of MOX fuel in the reactor. And we run trials to see what fraction of trials have greater than 95% separation, where, which is probably not strong enough to start a war over, by the way, but it's strong enough for us to be able to see the effects. And this is one slide of that. So the y-axis is the simulated MOX fuel percentage, so let's call it the actual plutonium fuel percentage. And the x-axis is the declared plutonium fuel. And if the actual is very similar to the declared, then none of the trials basically will show you a difference between those two. You will not get a statistically significant difference between the declared and actual. However, let's just take one point. If the declared is 60%, but the actual is 40% or 30%, then you would see a difference. And you would often see a pretty alarming difference in the number of antineutrinos in this asymmetry observable compared to what you expected from the declared fuel. This is another plot that has a similar kind of story to it. This is where the background, so there's many ideas for the detectors. Some of the detectors are just really simple ones where there's an inverse beta decay, antineutrino comes in, converts, creates a signal, and then you count it. Those have a fair amount of background in them because there's all sorts of cosmological Earth things and so on that can create neutrinos that can mimic what's coming out of the reactor. But then more sophisticated reactors might have directionality capability. So you know it came from here versus there. So you want to only choose events that point back to the reactor. Furthermore, every time there's an inverse beta decay, a neutron is formed. And that neutron will then interact maybe with gadolinium. You dope it with some gadolinium, and it will poof, and then you'll get a timing offset from the original flash signal, and that reduces the background a lot because of what you've seen from that. Okay, so in the super good experiments, which who knows if they can be built, but if the background is effectively 0, then you get a much better resolution on the percentage of the core that would be exchanged out with LEU fuel, and you would still see this difference from the declared. If the background is really high, then your resolution is not very good. And so one of the lessons from analyses like this is that if you want to play in this game, you're going to need a very good background rejection experiment, especially the kinds of experiments that are put on the back of a train car and brought to a site above ground. That can be a problem. Okay, so let me end with a few comments. So IAEA has a lot to say about this. This was remarked in the first talk about safeguarding. They're the world's experts, and along with a lot of other national groups, they see that a diversion of a single significant quantity in 90 days would be a really important target. So that would be something like a diversion of 8 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium in 90 days. And if it's more than 90 days, you multiply that 8 kilograms and scale it. So our method at present gives in 540 days a maximal sensitivity in what we're doing of about 80 kilograms or more of weapons-grade plutonium removal, which is not quite at the IAEA's desired sensitivity. So there's still more work to be done, and that work includes better, larger detector. We assumed usually a 20% efficiency on the detector, which means only 20% of the neutrinos, antineutrinos coming out of the reactor that interact with the detector get registered, and full background rejection. And then another current approach that a lot of people are using and working on is exploiting the spectral dependence. So it's not just the total count rate that's different, and it's not just the temporal evolution of the fuel that's different, but also there's a spectral difference. The U-235 antineutrinos are a bit harder than the 239 neutrinos that come out. Now, the more you try to cut, the more you have fewer events, and the more you might disrupt your statistic. And so there's an optimization going on here that has to be carefully done and understood. And we did not do the high spectral dependence analysis because we did not put in very sophisticated spectral dependence on the detection rate, which you need to do. Okay, so the last thing I will say is that there was a wonderful new tools report that came out only a couple of years ago. And they had many reasons why antineutrinos might be of use and relevance in safeguarding. One of the goals of new tools was, is this worth it at all? Because IAEA has a lot of really excellent safeguarding techniques, and a $500 million or $300 million neutrino detector might not be the most cost-effective way to do everything they need to do. And so in multiple discussions with them and others throughout IAEA and other experts in the world, 2 ideas surfaced that were still potentially relevant. One is advanced reactors. There's difficult safeguarding challenges where neutrino monitoring could be valuable, and that is a forefront topic to explore. And so-called future reactor deals, which is basically what this talk is the relevance of what I discussed in this talk is probably most for that, with some applications later for advanced reactors. So future nuclear deals is somebody wants to build a nuclear reactor. It's a sensitive country. People are worried. We will pay a lot for it, but only if you have a neutrino detector nearby, so we can determine if you are doing any sneaky illicit activity, all couched in very diplomatic language, of course. Okay, so there's significant ongoing activity to investigate potential value of anti-neutrino monitoring for nuclear security, and I will just leave it there and be happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. A question? Could you go to the microphone so we can record it? I'm sorry. Or you can come up here if you want. It's easier. Thank you.
Right, you were getting there right at the end with that comment about future reactor deals. About how big a detector are you imagining? About how close to the illicit reactor is
Yes.
your thought?
So about big as several tons, and how close? Within 25 kilometers. So everything that you saw here, yes, thanks for that comment. I might have written it somewhere, but it was in small letters. 25 kilometers is what we assumed as the distance away. So it's close enough that you would see a lot of rate, but it's not so close that if there are sensitivities that are involved and inspectors are kicked out, it would be a whole nother level of diplomatic concern if they also kicked out people 20 kilometers away from a passive neutrino detector.
Could you just comment the volume that 25 tons of this material would?
Oh, it's about sort of the size of this, a fourth of this room, a third of this room, I think it turns out, but not quite this high. But think of a big, so one ISO container, that's the size. In fact, the IAEA prefers that the neutrino detector fit on an ISO container. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Your next question?
Thanks, James. That was a really excellent talk. When you're talking about absolute numbers of neutrinos, wouldn't you need to know a lot about the reactor design and the amount of fuel that was in the reactor? So the time series made a lot more sense to me, that you see the changes, but it sounds like you also think that the absolute number of neutrinos is an important criterion. So could you talk about how you would know what you'd need to know in order to make a measurement like that?
Yes. So, yeah, we stayed away from absolute numbers because we just created asymmetries, and because we do not know how to normalize the total rate, and you know, there can be small differences, and you wouldn't know how to do it. So we never utilized actually total anti-neutrino rates at all in our discussion, except for backgrounds. So in a realistic background scenarios, the way you do it, of course, is you just wait some time and have your detector and you measure. So you don't actually have to compute it. You can use data to extract it, and that will be a very powerful reduction of systematic errors on the background rate. So in that sense, there's an absolute neutrino background rate, but we can get that through data.
Okay. Another question?
You mentioned the changes in background rate, but how did you test the changes in background rate with one single detector type? And are you going to explore different detector types going forwards to try and meet the target that they've set?
Yes, there's active research on, there's a detector groups around the world who are actively researching the various liquid scintillator detectors with appropriate doping to see the the neutron interaction later. That's not something I do, is the neutrino detector part, but it's an active group.
And I guess what choices were made for you to choose the detector that you chose for the study, I guess?
Oh, yeah, this is just a standard detector. This is the EPJ-260 kind of material. that a lot of neutrino detectors are using and building up. So it's a liquid scintillator detector, and we just chose a standard design, nothing super fancy. We did not want to assume an ability greatly more than, or anything more than what standard detectors claim they can do right now. But there's an active area, as you pointed out, there's an active area to try to make detectors which are much more efficient than the standard one that we chose.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'd like to just open up for broader questions now, if that's okay. Sure.
Yes, this is for James again. So my understanding is in trying to look for nuclear terrorists, underground terrorists who are trying to make their own bombs, okay, which is something that they've been trying to persuade the North Koreans, for example, to give them enough nuclear grade material so that they could make a dirty bomb, for example. There are ways of monitoring shipping containers. So if somebody's actually made some of this stuff and they want to sell it to I can't remember the names of the terrorists in the Middle East. But anyway, so how does this relate to what you're doing? Can you, is this what we're putting to detect shipping containers, maybe containing nuclear weapons grade material at shipping ports? Are you related to that in any way, what you're doing?
Yes, right. Thank you. No, we're not involved with that. My guess is that you would need an enormous detector, much greater than what we were talking about here. The rates would be much smaller. This is not an active core burning, yeah, we're not doing that. Yes.
So I have a question going back to Richard Meserve's talk, and actually I have two questions. One, you mentioned that you think that at least to some extent the waste disposal problem has been solved. I assume that you're talking about what Finland and to some extent Sweden are doing, which is deep, very kilometer deep in ancient granite. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, whether we can achieve that in the United States. And the second issue is there any reason to be looking at thorium reactors?
Well, let me just say that we actually do have one successful disposal facility in the United States. It's the Waste Isolation Project Ban. It is not for spent fuel or high-level waste, but it has some of the characteristics, and that's in deep salt. When I said I think that it's not a technical problem, what I meant is that there's been a series of studies by the National Academy of Sciences that have asserted, not proven, but they've asserted that deep geologic disposal in granite would, as an example, would certainly provide the necessary isolation. It would have to be in the right place, it have to be stable and so forth. It have a series of characteristics. But technically, we think we know how to do this. We just don't have the political or social capacity to do that. And in both Finland and Sweden, they're making great progress. In those cases, they're in different geologic media, but they're deep geologic disposal. And they have been able to solve not only we believe the technical problem, but the social and political problem as well. And that's largely through consent-based siting, is they got the communities that were involved to actually compete for the opportunities for the economic gains of the jobs and so forth that would arise from having a disposal facility. And in Sweden, the amusing thing is that they got it down to two communities that were competing, and the losing community was paid at the end because of the misfortune that they'd lost the opportunity to have a disposal facility. We'd be so lucky if we could have something like that here. Oh, thorium, I haven't actually looked at the thorium reactor. Of course, it's a fertile fuel rather than a fissile fuel. So there's a lot more of it, which is why the Indians in particular were very interested in it. But you'd have to have a breeding cycle to turn the thorium-232 into uranium-233. And then you have a reprocessing stage you're going to go through. So, I mean, there are more complicated proliferation issues you need to deal with. U-233 would be very fine weapons material.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talks that were really very pleasant and also with a lot of things to learn. The first question I have it for you, Richard. I didn't saw the lead technology in your list of the technologies. Is that because US is not interested, or?
Yes, the Russians have been very much interested in lead bismuth reactors, and have built submarine reactors along those lines. I think they're the only ones who have been pursuing the lead, but theoretically, and they built actually submarine reactors that have been lead cooled. So that is very possible.
But Westinghouse, for instance, now is declaring that the lead-fast reactor will be their next horse reactor after the AP1000.
I'm not aware that Westinghouse is pushing a lead reactor.
Argonne National Lab was also working on this in the Gen
could be,
4.
well.
But I'm a bit surprised that it isn't. The other question or remark was actually the gentleman said if we have a problem in the series production, and then you have to call back your reactors, etc. But do you think that conceiving those reactors in such a way that even if you have an issue, you don't have to move your reactor back to the base, but you can just consider it as a mechanism, and the piece that will go wrong, you can change it there?
Ideally, of course, you'd want to be able to do that. I can't, that's design-specific consideration you'd have to make, but it would be very desirable to make sure you have basically as many scenarios as you could imagine, that you have a soft failure and something that is repairable right there.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question. So just a question.
Please let the other statement waiting. Thank you.
I had a quick question for Mr. Mazurv. With all of the problems, is it possible to attempt to start building advanced reactors in different countries to potentially alleviate some of those problems, or would there just be less funding if it's not in the U.S.?
Could you, one more time, I missed the beginning of your question.
Yeah, so would it be possible to start production of advanced reactors in a place outside of the U.S. to potentially alleviate some of the many problems, or would there be less funding?
Well, I certainly, the U.S. is not the only place that's interested in advanced reactors. Many foreign countries are pursuing them as well. So I don't think it's inevitable that they necessarily would have to be produced here. And there certainly could be test information that comes in from foreign sources. And one of the things that we really should do is actually make sure that the regulators are all communicating with each other so that, and we're doing that particularly with the Canadians right now, so if there's an analysis that the regulator is undertaking in Canada, that there's cross-fertilization with the examination of the same reactor in the United States, so you don't need to duplicate work, and so you get, as many minds working on the problem as possible. It's very desirable. So I think that will happen.
Yeah, I think we have time for another question or two, but not from the same person. Okay.
So I have a question for Laura. So first of all, thank you for this talk, because this is a really important issue, and thank you for bringing this to light for us. But you had mentioned when you had drawn out the timeline for nuclear missile response, that like the Russian missiles will strike us at the end unless this is a false alarm. And I just want to push a little bit more on this false alarm scenario and what can be done to reduce the risk of a catastrophic nuclear missile exchange that starts just because of an early warning system malfunctioning, and there's a false alarm that triggers the US thinks the Russians are attacking us and we respond, or vice versa. You had mentioned moving away from sole presidential authority, but is there anything in addition to that that we could do?
Is this on? Thanks, that's such a great question. Well, certainly like one big thing is to just adopt policies that don't enforce a fast timeline. And it, I would say, arguably isn't really necessary. The one component that drives that fast timeline really is the land-based ICBMs. And if you are going to say, we need a secure deterrent, but that's it, I would argue, and I think there, many would argue that we could do that with a submarine-based nuclear force. They're essentially undetectable, so untargetable, and provide a secure second strike should something happen. So one option is to just forego the hair trigger, sort of the fast response option entirely, which really drives that time frame. But you asked about false alarms, and one thing I usually talk about if I talk longer is about the number of times that's happened. And there have been a number of pretty hair-raising stories that are in the public domain. Probably there are others we just don't know about. And often there are because there are defects in the early warning system that are misinterpreted. They're technical defects often. And a lot of the stories had in common a person in the system which was skeptical of the technology. Like, I don't think this looks like what we expected to. Let's slow it down before we go further. One of the things, and this is an interesting challenge, I think, for us as scientific people, one of the proposed solutions to some of this is to introduce artificial intelligence into that decision-making loop, which in one sense you could say maybe machines could help us with our decision-making. On the other hand, just having seen that humans have in the past disrupted this fast channel, I think there are arguments. So that's an active area of research. So I guess to sum up, take the option of fast, the unnecessary things that drive your system to go faster, and then think about, with care, your decision-making and your skepticism about your systems.
Thank you so much.
Hello. I also have a question for Dr. Grigo. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. So basically, I'm wondering, how do you like approach people who justify the use of nuclear weapons? Like, for example, we see in World War II, where many argued that dropping the bombs in Hiroshima were necessary to prevent further casualties. So obviously, that's like a controversial issue to talk about. But I'm wondering how you would approach that.
Well, so I guess I won't go into the complex history around Hiroshima and Nagasaki because that's, I'm not a historian, but I think today we know an awful lot about what nuclear weapons can do. And there is a thread of discourse that I am particularly concerned about where people say, oh, it's not an existential threat. Oh, it's not as bad as you think. Oh, we're much better than we used to be about, control and precision and, further effects. I think one thing I would, nobody has satisfactorily really come up with a reason why the use of one wouldn't almost automatically cascade into use of many. So there's always that question. But I think, I guess there's an awful lot that we know about the use, and they're not discriminate. They kill civilians, almost certainly. There are so many sort of international legal reasons why the use of nuclear weapons shouldn't be the case. And I'm sort of rambling, but I think the fact that even one could be a humanitarian disaster and many would be a civilization-ending disaster, I think should be more or less self-evident. I don't know.
Thank you.
That's where I come down.
If I may ask the question, why there is no effort in US on transmutation of nuclear waste? Is there any strong reason for that? And why did you abandon, you see, the ideas of transmuting nuclear waste? And also the second question,
The problem has been a political one
I see.
in terms of dealing with nuclear waste. Congress it started a process that was an evaluation of a bunch of sites all across the country. And it ended being narrowed down to 3 sites, 2 in large populous states and another one in Nevada. Congress terminated the process at that stage and decided it should be Nevada as the politically weakest state. No one imagined at the time that Harry Reid would become the speaker, would become the majority leader in the Senate. But he and the Nevadans felt that they'd been fingered to take the waste from the rest of the United States unfairly, that the process wasn't fair. And so they ended up in a political process to make them a victim. So you have enormous hostility in Nevada and a dedicated attitudes to prevent the Yucca Mountain site from ever going into operation. So that's what's happened. We're at a complete stalemate with regard to the Yucca Mountain site.
Yes. So if I may ask, you mentioned in a very clear way that the expansion of Russians in terms of constructing, you see, in the Third War, many reactors is a process that it will be with large difficulty counterbalanced with whatever happens in US, because it's a political support. But are you aware also that following Fukushima, most of the mines, you see, has been of uranium has been bought by Rosatom. So in some sense, when you were talking, I was asking myself if you have this program for the development in the US, are you sure that you see your local mines would provide sufficient supply of uranium for your program?
Actually, uranium supply is a huge issue right now for utilities all over the world. And the reason is for fear that Russian uranium will be cut off. About 20% of the uranium that's burned in US reactors today comes from Russia. And about 40% of the world supply comes from Russia. And there is concern that we have kept that, so far, kept that channel open for purchase of uranium because it's hard to replace it. But the utilities are very worried that at some stage the US will just, through sanctions, seek to prevent it. So there's really great interest, political interest right now about uranium supply. And that's an ongoing battle right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to have to cut off this wonderful discussion because it turns out the speakers have another appointment, so which we need to make. Thank you very much.